All right, we're going to talk about prone one-arm trap raise, which is a great arm care exercise that we use with just about all of our guys in their first month back and throughout the off season. The problem is it's also an exercise that a lot of people will really butcher the technique. So I want to go through kind of the rationale for it, but also some of the more common mistakes that we see when people try to implement it. So one of the first things that I always look at before we actually get the ball rolling on this exercise is how does an individual present posturally. So Jacob's actually a really good example of some of the stuff that we see with a lot of our baseball guys as the off season gets going is we'll see a lot of guys who have really downsloped shoulders. You can see how he's a guy who carries a fair amount of muscle mass, but you almost don't see upper traps because he's so kind of stuck in scapular depression and downward rotation. So the typical pitcher will lose upward rotation over the course of the season. One of the reasons we do a prone trap raise is because it helps us to learn how to kind of re-educate that scapula to upwardly rotate correctly, whether it's so that we can overhead press as a general fitness person or so that we can get to a good arm slot as a thrower. So when you look at these guys in the back posture, in many cases they sit heavily depressed, whereas someone with more of a neutral posture might actually be up a little bit more so that we can actually see a little bit of contouring. And obviously there are landmarks that you can measure off of based on the positioning along the thoracic spine, but as a general rule of thumb, you can really eyeball guys who sit low. Okay. What does that mean in the context of a prone trap raise? Well, the line of pull of your low traps is about 135 degrees. So this is the angle we're going to work with. What you'll often see with folks who maybe have this postural presentation is they may aggressively crank down with the lat because that's what's in part pulling them down into that depression. So rather than getting good posterior tilt, we get aggressive depression, and that interferes, may impinge. We may not get to the position we need to in terms of upward rotation. So we'll see all that in the table, but it's good to kind of appreciate it in standing. The other thing we want to notice in a guy like Jacob, most of the athletes we encounter are stuck in more extension, meaning they have a little bit more of a pronounced arch in their low back. They may be kind of stuck in plantar flexion at their ankles. They may have a forward head posture. They just don't do well in terms of shutting off their lats. These are why you see a lot of extension-based back pain. You may see anterior hip pain. There's a lot of different things that you can see. These guys are ones who may be more predisposed to lat strains. So it's very important that we take that into consideration as well. So we need to make sure that the core positioning is correctly before we do our scapular exercise on the table. So I'm actually have Chris jump in here and demonstrate it. I think Chris is maybe a little bit of a better example because he starts from a little bit more of a neutral posture. So we'll have him lay face down on the table. I think some of the common questions people ask are, hey, are we doing both arms at the same time? Are we doing one arm? We always teach it one arm at a time, just a little bit easier to focus. We always make sure that the chin is actually supported on the table. So we want people to kind of pack that neck, make a double chin so as to not let them drift off and be in that forward head posture. Effectively, what we're trying to do is we're trying to account for all their different compensation patterns in terms of shifting into that extension pattern. Okay? So if Chris had that big arch, we may actually even slide like a rolled up mat underneath him or a towel just to kind of give him a little bit of posterior tilt, flatten that low back out, and then we'll kind of go from there. First thing you're going to look for is actually setup position. Once you've kind of fixed the head to the hips positioning, look at kind of where the scapula goes. Some people may drift forward aggressively anterior tilt, knowing that you're probably going to have to bring them a little bit more back into posterior tilt to initiate it. Other people will actually set up kind of back down here. And you know that when they're carrying in that angle, chances are they're people who don't really do well in terms of shutting their lat off. So the big thing to remember with this exercise, it's a scapulothoracic movement. It's not a glenohumeral movement so much. Okay, and that's just a fancy way of saying the goal is to move the shoulder blade on the rib cage, not just to move the arm on the scapula or the shoulder blade. All right, so what we don't want is people to do a lot of movement of their humerus, their upper arm, without getting good positioning of the scapula first. All right, so the goal is to try to get that lower trap engaged by basically bringing him into a little bit of posterior tilt. So what I'll often do as I coach this is I'll come up and I'll just block him off. So I don't want him to be able to yank down. A lot of guys you'll see will initially go like right into this movement and have no concept of how to get into that good angle. So we don't want them to be able to pull down with their lats. We want these lats really relaxed to allow that good upward rotation to take place. So I'll block him off right there, and all Chris is going to do is give me a little bit of posterior tilt of the scapula and then come along for the ride. You'll notice he actually stops slightly short of even with the level of his shoulder. I'm not forcing him to get all the way up here. That wouldn't be correct, all right? So instead what we want is we want a little bit of posterior tilt, and then the upper arm comes along for the ride. You'll often see people that will bend the elbow and wind up here, and they won't actually be in that good line of pull that we want. So instead, we want people to get up to about 135 degrees As that happens, it's just a gentle posterior tilt and upward rotation still takes place to allow us to get here. Okay? So one of the kind of external focus cues that I'll give guys in order to make sure they're in the right position, I'll say, clear room for my hand. So if Chris gets good scapular posterior tilt, see how my hand can slide right in under the humeral head? Now, let's show how this would be again. If he weren't to get that scapular posterior tilt, he just moves through his arm. I can't get my hand underneath. So we're looking to do that little bit of tipping back to allow that humeral head to sit right where it's supposed to be. Okay, so we usually do this for sets of 8 reps. We may use it pre-exercise. We may use it as a filler between some of our lifting stuff. We may do it before guys throw. Really valuable stuff to get that low trap involved and help to get a little bit more scapular upward rotation. Okay. With that said, you are going to coach it a little bit different for someone who's maybe a little bit stiffer like Chris versus someone who's really loose jointed like Jacob was. What we often see in the guys who are really loose jointed is they can still get to the same end range even without scapular movement. So effectively what they're doing is they're almost popping out of the socket and forcing that range is there. So it should all be about what you feel here. It should all be in low traps. If you're noticing stuff in the anterior shoulder, in the biceps tendon, you're doing it incorrectly, and in fact you're probably doing more harm than good. What you're doing is you're probably hanging out both anteriorly and superiorly and irritating both the anterior capsule, biceps tendon, and maybe even some of the nerve structures in the front of your shoulder. So really, really important to get that low trap engaged. Some people, Jacob being a good example, it's perfectly fine if they feel some upper trap in there. If you think about how low down he is, that upper trap is going to work with your low trap to create that upward rotation, and that's something I'm fine with in somebody like Jacob. In more of a general fitness population, we may actually want to cue them to quiet that upper trap down and just really focus on using that low trap to get where we need to be. Okay. Only last thing I want to show you is, let's slide right to the center of the table, Chris. You'll see a lot of people that are looking for a convenient way to do this out in the field, and what they'll do, and you probably want to bend your knees and slide back towards the wall, they'll try to do both arms at the same time, just laying on the ground. And what they'll do is basically the lift off, okay? So when we do this, there's a fundamental problem with that. Most people are simply doing humeral movement on the scapula and going right to that position of impingement. So we don't use this exercise. I'd much rather see people do it off the table, literally just working with whatever range they have, as opposed to going right to an end range that's a very advanced position and then ask them to differentiate between scapulothoracic movement and glenohumeral movement. So regressing that, if you come over to the side, it's perfectly acceptable for someone just to have a little bit of scapular movement to get where they need to be and only go part way. Work with what you have. As long as you're feeling in the right places, you're good. If you need to regress this, you can actually bend the elbow just a little bit to kind of shorten the lever arm or the resistance and make it a little bit easier to work with. So we will actually have guys who may need to learn this and we'll just bring them in here a little bit, or we may even go to a prone low trap activation where we'll go right in. And all we're going to do is we're going to set those arms in the line of pull low traps and just teach guys, give me a little bit of posterior tilt from this position. So all it is a basic low-level progression that basically the table takes some of the weight of the arm, makes it a little bit easier on them. So obviously a very important exercise, but something that there are a lot of different ways it can go wrong. This is one reason why we don't do YTWL circuits. Okay? If a Y is this complex, there's no place for doing it as part of a circuit that involves a lot of fatigue and puts people in bad positions from the get-go. So make sure the core is stabilized in the position it needs to be, make sure you're packing the neck, make sure the scapula is moving on the rib cage, and then you're not just cranking that upper arm on the socket and irritating the front and top of your shoulder.